Hello and welcome, welcome. Welcome back to Tuesday Talk. This is a Boots a Shot. Oh, hold on, there's nobody here. Wait, hold on. Why is this not? There we go. Comments. Welcome, welcome. This is a Boots a Shot with the Shrine of Ma'at, and we are here for another live edition of Tuesday Talk. For those of you who joined us last week, we have this wonderful guest back with us. This is Tutibsaa from the Earth Center. And I was just telling him before we came back on that he's a great guest because he explains things so well. And we got a lot of awesome feedback from having him as a guest. People really enjoyed last week's um, Tuesday Talk. So without further ado, I'd like to reintroduce, in case you missed it from last week, Tutibsaa He's a Dogon initiate who's learning Kemetic philosophy and spirituality from an indigenous perspective. He's the head Mer and director of the Earth Center in New Jersey, in the New Jersey Temple in Newark, New Jersey. So his YouTube page is Kebta and Instagram is Kebta. At the very end, we're going to give you all of the contact information. Okay. So welcome to Tutibsaa. It's so great to have you back.
Well, Jay, I appreciate you guys having me back.
Yes, it was great. It was awesome to get you guys about how we met. At one point in time. I was searching for the original African calendar, because I knew we were functioning on a baby calendar, if you will, the Gregorian calendar. I was told the Earth Center has the calendars. You should look it up for them. So I looked for the calendar, and it was so long ago, I don't really remember what happened. Fast forward to this past summer at the International African Arts Festival in Brooklyn, and they had the table, and I was like, "Oh my God, the Earth Center! That sounds so familiar." I was like, "Why do I know that name?" I'm like, "The calendar! Oh my God, they're here!" So I went over there, excited, and here we are. And so last week we talked about the Kemetic calendar, and this week we're going to be talking about the Dogon tribe and the Dogon spirituality. And as you may know, and I will reiterate this, African spirituality across the continent is basically the same thing, because they come from the same mind, culture, and spirit. Today we're going to dive deeper into the Dogon spirituality. So without further ado, we have Tutibsaa. And my very first question, to get it on and popping, is can you tell us who the founder is of the Earth Center, and who he was, and his relationship with the Dogon tribe and spirituality, and how that enhanced the Earth Center?
So again, I appreciate you guys having me on. The first thing I'd like to do is, acknowledge the forces in the non-material. Not only my ancestors, the ancestors of the Earth Center, the ancestors behind this great work, and all the unseen forces, including the deities in the work that are standing behind us and really pushing this work forward. And one more time, could you repeat the question? Sorry about that.
Yes. The question is, to speak about the founder of the Earth Center, his connection with the Dogon tribe, and a little bit about the founder and his spirituality and how he was introduced to the Dogon tribe.
Huh. Well, uh, the founder of the Earth Center is Neb Naba Musa Dinabu. And Master Naba is a actual Dogon. So he is not someone that went to the Dogon and got initiated. He's someone that's actually coming from a Dogon bloodline and was, initiated in the culture that he came from. And then the Earth Center was an extension of, bringing that work to the West and opening up the culture that had been preserved for thousands of years,
Awesome.
and the original, MTOM or Kemetic mystery schools that were, done in the Nile Valley thousands of years ago, and that had gone into secret for thousands of years to protect the culture and in order for the culture to survive. So I would like to make the clarification that uh, Master Naba is a gourmandche that is, coming from the region of West Africa, in Burkina Faso, and he's an actual Dogon as opposed to you know, he's not a Dogon initiate that found the Dogon or
Right.
someone that found the Dogon per se. That's his culture that he's coming from.
Right. Right. That's a great clarification because so many of us who were displaced due to enslavement, we have to look and search and find and ask people and you know find it and then get reintroduced, and we have to remember who we are and find our and basically find our way. I'm Black American on both sides. That's what I had to do. My parents gave me as much Black awareness and Blackness as they had to give me, and from that I was just kind of off and finding it. So to be a part of an organization where there's a person who his bloodline was never interrupted, so in one sense, it's amazingly pure. That is awesome. I'm glad that you clarified that and made that very clear. He wasn't reintroduced back to his culture. The chain was never broken from from the original mother, from the original ancestor. So that's beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, go ahead, go ahead.
It's. I know that there's a lot of. Uh, we have a lot of people that are part of the diaspora that weren't that were disconnected from their culture at some point in time, and a lot of us are unfamiliar with our roots, and it's very difficult for us to reconnect with our ancestral culture. And it's important to remember that, or it's important to know for the people that don't know, and it's important for the people that do know to remember that, when we're talking about Kemet and we're talking about, the civilization known as Kemet, we're talking about a cultural territory that sat atop a geographical location.
Right.
So it was a way of life, it was a way of living. And where these practices even came from and how they connect to African spirituality is, particularly, there are a lot of tribes and regions that the original inhabitants of the Nile Valley migrated to in order to protect this culture. So there are tribes and areas that you can find uh, throughout Merita, but particularly where we find a concentration of these tribes and where they settled into is in West Africa. So when we're talking about the Dogon tribe in and of itself, we're talking about a collection of bloodlines, a collection of families that are the descendants of the original inhabitants of the Nile Valley. So we're talking about the people that actually held the culture and actually established the civilization of Kemet. The original people that fought for this culture, worked for this culture, sweated for this culture, and these great achievements that the world to this day is still studying and is still attempting to decipher and decode. Whereas that this civilization and this culture is alive and well and has been hidden from the world for thousands of years. So it's important it's important to highlight the fact that Master Naba himself is someone coming from one of those families and is a part of those bloodlines that migrated at that time to protect the knowledge and protect the achievements that had been reached during the time of the great ancestors and since the time of the pharaohs.
I like the clarification or the addition of information of the different like families, if you will, that all migrated and congregated in this area. And again, the description, we, a lot of the people who follow the Shrine of Ma'at and Tuesday talks and my Monday meditations and stuff like that have some kind of a background in a little bit of this history. So when we talk about our migration from east to the west, this is an example of that. And Master Naba is a person who was, a part of that in terms of his lineage, in that way. So yes, that
So when we're talking about the migration even from east to west,
mhm,
we're even talking about Kemet at its height was a
mhm,
cultural territory that spanned the continent of Merita or Africa, that we, as we call it colonially, and the South America, North America, or as we call it uh, indigenous wise, Manu, and different parts of Europe, Asia, and the whole continent of Australia. So at its height, that's where that's some of the geographical locations that this civilization spanned across. And there was a time during where these foreigners were coming in, and you're talking about the capital of the world, essentially. Like, when we start talking about the capital of the world today, we may talk about, like, you can talk about some western cities, like maybe everyone wants to go to New York City, everyone wants to go to Los Angeles, everyone wants to go to certain major cities to really feel a part of the western culture, the modern colonial culture. And when we're talking about Kemet at its height and where people that wanted to be a part of the civilization and the culture would go to in order to get initiated, we're talking about the region that we know of as the Nile Valley.
right.
So migration in and of itself that we're referring to in terms of the migration that happened from the Nile Valley to the West Africa and different parts of Merita was a very specific migration that occurred to protect the culture and ensure the survival of the culture. So even what Master Naba brought to the West and opening up those doors is something that is a seed that was planted thousands of years ago. So these migrations, I think, is important for us to distinguish, the difference in terms of these migrations and the weight and the seriousness of the migration that we're talking about and highlighting to give to people for clarity and clarification's sake, because the opening of the doors back to the culture that was done by Master Naba is something that was very meticulous and intentional, whereas he was going to many different temples and following all the right avenues, ensuring that he was going to the kingships and following the structure and the civilizational protections that had been in place for thousands of years and passed down through these cultures and hidden from these usurpers and these people coming in attempting to take the culture and use it for whatever agenda they had.
I just learned something new. I didn't know it was that targeted and that specific, and that he was, making sure that he went through all of the kingships and townships to before he proceeded. Did he? Where was the first Earth Center founded? Was it on the continent, or was it in Europe? Where was it founded? The first one.
So the first Earth Center that was established in Manu, or the United or America, was in Chicago. And there were some time that before he even brought the Earth Center, he was, we're talking about something, I think it's in, let me just say this, is that this is when we talk about Kepta or the Earth Center, I think, to understand it from a modern perspective, and understand it from, how it needs to be contextualized or framed within the modern society, we can look at it as just a organization. But in order to really contextualize it and to communicate
Hmm.
where it's coming from, we're talking about a mission that's been around for thousands of years.
Right. Right.
And that mission, that civilization had to go into hiding, essentially, had to be protected and had to be preserved. And even the Earth Center, it's almost like a misinformation to say that the Earth Center was founded in Chicago. You could say
Right.
that's when Master Naba brought it back to the West for those doors to open up again.
That makes sense. So when you said it was hidden to be protected, that was around the time when Kemet fell and we had all the foreigners coming in? You mean, is that around that time?
So there was a time where people were coming in and they were attempting to take over the culture. They were attempting to take over these things.
Hmm.
And there was a huge misunderstanding in terms of the approach that our ancestors had and the way they were functioning and what they were doing. Because everything they were doing and everything how they were functioning was rooted in harmonizing with the existence and fitting into nature, and accurately assessing their surroundings and being able to fit into their surroundings and fit into nature
Right.
and fit into the existence in a macro sense and a micro sense. So
Right.
when you had these people coming in that were seeing the achievements that our ancestors were able to achieve, they wanted to be a part of it. But it's the equivalent of someone that goes to the gym every day, and I walk up to them and I say, well, I want you to give me your muscles.
Exactly. That's not how that works.
It's not the
Period.
way it works. You
Right.
can't transfer your muscles, something you worked for and struggled for and walked a path to find. You can't transfer that to somebody else.
Cannot.
So there was a blatant misunderstanding to the approach and to what our ancestors were doing by these people that were coming in, and the constant infringements upon their ability to fulfill what they were attempting to achieve and harmonize with the existence and march closer and closer to the divine. Eventually they said, well, in order to protect the civilization and to protect what we've done and what we've achieved, we need to take it and we need to hide it. And particularly these people that were coming in were fixated on the flesh, were fixated on the material.
You're right.
And we even see the connection today with, because we live in a society and a culture, when we're speaking about the West, that's connected and is the baby or the, the those colonizers' wildest dream in terms of what they were looking to achieve in terms of the civilization that we live in today. So They said, let's take it and we're going to hide it, and we're not going to build these elaborate structures anymore. They're coming and they're impressed by everything that we're achieving, and they're looking at the pyramids, they're looking at these structures that we're building. So we're going to take it and we're going to hide it. But we're going to hide it and we're going to, keep it hidden by making sure that we don't build any of these elaborate structures. To this day, that civilization exists. It's just hidden. And it's hidden in ways that you can go into a village and you think you're just wandering into a random village, but you're literally walking in to a village that you can consider Kemet. So I think it's important for us to really slowly, talk about these things and really slowly bridge the gap, because we're talking about things that are hidden from humanity due to colonization for very specific reasons, in order to stop humanity from being able to rise out of the current state that we're in by a few people that are comfortable with the way that the world is going, because they're benefiting from the way that the world is going.
Right. It works for them. Right. So give us some background on how you became a part of the Dogon spirituality. If you were born into it, were you Christian before? Start with whatever you were before and bring us up to speed.
So, I'm an initiate. So I've been in this work for about 2.5 years or so. And the thing is it's very easy to focus on a person. It's very easy to look at a person. And at the end of the day, who's really going anywhere or doing anything to listen to a person? You want to see what the person has within them, or what they're standing on, or what's standing behind them. And I'm someone that was born in the States, and through going through my initiation and really turning my eyes back to the culture, and turning my eyes back to Merita and the traditions, I was able to find out a lot about where my ancestry comes from. But that was due to, me going through the initiation and going through the steps to find those things. My parents come from Sudan, but at the end of the day, to talk about Sudan, you're just talking about a colonial name for a region.
Right. Exactly.
To really find out what my ancestors were practicing, to really find out where my ancestors were from, to find out what my ancestors were doing and the way that my ancestors really functioned, it was me going back to the Dogon to find those things and to be able to reclaim those things that were lost.
Did you know it was Dogon, or did you, while you were looking, you came across, you found it, or you found what you were looking for? Or did you know beforehand?
Did I know beforehand
that the Dogon was a part of your own lineage?
Well, the Dogon are a part of everyone's lineage, because we're talking about Kemet, that's a civilization that united humanity. So it would be very short-sighted, and it would be very juvenile almost for me to only make it seem that this is something that the original inhabitants of the Nile Valley are only allowed to practice, and it's only their culture.
Right.
It's a culture that's for humanity. It's a culture that united humanity. So we it's very easy and it's very lazy almost to, if I was to say that the only thing that drew me to this is the fact that my ancestors are from Sudan.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, colonialism and the way that people function in terms of colonization, it's a mindset.
Say
So,
that again. Say it again.
so colonization, it's it's a mindset. It's the way that you live. It's the way that you function.
That's right.
So there are people that look like you, that look like me, that are colonizers
That's right.
because you think like a colonizer and you function like a colonizer. And then you have people that may look like someone that you can consider the enemy, or you can consider someone that is coming from the colonizer's culture because of them being, European or wherever they're from. And then you look at them and you say, well, that person's a colonizer. The thing is that's not accurate, because colonization is a mindset at the end of the day. So it's almost, I don't want to, feed into the ignorance and feed into the to the way that people may direct their thinking, or to direct, the way that they're framing things,
Right.
that the civilization is based on the color of someone's skin or where they're coming from per se. Because we're talking about Kemet. If we really get into the nitty gritty of Kemet, and we really get into the way that that civilization was structured and the way that it worked, then you're talking about what the pharaoh actually represented, and what his job was, what he did, and what his function was. And if we get into that, then we can actually start talking about humanity as a whole, and the dark time that humanity has been in, and the things we need to do to get ourselves out, instead of fixating on a silly notion that comes from colonization, which is skin color and, region, and, oh, well, this person isn't coming from the culture because they're from here, or this person isn't coming from the culture because they look like this, and so on and so forth.
Okay. That makes sense. I understand what you're saying. We all, in modern times, we have names for people who are of African descent who act like colonizers. There are multiple names. I'm not going to say them here on Tuesday Talk, but we're all familiar with them. It's important to understand that two major points that he was making. This Kemetic culture and civilization influenced the world, and it still does in a lot of ways that are in our faces, but without knowing the history, the ignorance blinds us to seeing it. So in some ways it's still hidden, because if you don't know what you're looking at, then you miss it. So that influence was always there. And the other thing is that when he was saying that it would be ignorant or lazy to say that he found the Dogon because his parents are from Sudan, meaning this the Dogon spirituality or Kemetic spirituality is something that, and I'm gonna extrapolate a bit. So if I'm going too far, then you let me know. Undergirds our civilization, undergirds what it is that how we lived every second of our day was guided by this by our spirituality. We didn't separate it. So now I'm going into what it is that we do at the Shrine of Ma'at, and the way that we talk about it. It's the same information. It's the same thing that Tutibsaa was saying, and so there's no separation of, you don't compartmentalize spirituality over here, food over here, science over there, your parents over there. All of it had divine energy. And because of that,
So
that's what made it cultural.
I'm just I'm just gonna interject and
Hmm.
say, science is not something that was started by our ancestors. Science is not something that's coming from our ancestors. And I think it's important for us to really make sure that we're distinguishing, you know, when something is coming from something pure. And even when I've gone back to the temples and gone back to West Africa, you know, things aren't functioning from a scientific perspective. Things aren't functioning from a religious perspective. Things aren't functioning a from the way that we live over here. And it's important to distinguish that when something is coming from a pure place, and it's not, you know, infected or coming from the colonization or from the perspective of colonization. Because the thing is that we have a lot of stuff here in America that is coming from a perspective of anthropology, and which, if we're going to talk about anthropology, then we have to talk about what it's based in. And it's based in an outsider going into a culture and attempting to study it in order to understand it, in order to take what fits, in order to take what they like, and then throw away the things they don't like, instead of understanding that this culture of Kemet is a very specific way of life, and it being preserved for thousands of years and hidden. And the Dogon are Kemetic. I don't want people to have a misunderstanding that these two things are not the same,
They're the same.
because they're the same. And you're talking about the Kemetic civilization, just a different name for it, per se, whatever you want to call it. So it's important for us to really inform people and for people to know that there's a big difference between something that's coming from anthropology, something that's coming from the perspective of the colonizer. And Kemetic civilization is not something that is learned from a book. The Kemetic civilization is not something that's learned from these institutions of colonization, because the fundamental misunderstanding that led to the current situation that humanity is in is the root and the seed in which everyone has to work against. And, you know, I just want to say that when we're talking about this civilization, when we're talking about the way it functions and where it comes from, people have the opportunity to actually go see it. People have the opportunity to actually understand it and to learn it and to live it, as opposed to studying it.
Hmm.
Because you can't learn something, you can't live something by reading about it in a book and then thinking that your intellectual understanding is the actual practical application of it. Those are two different things. So I just want to make sure that people understand that the way that we live here and the perspective that we approach things from the West is not the way that our ancestors functioned. And it's a completely different paradigm. So I don't want to mislead people to have them think that, everything that everyone is doing is, the same. Yes, the civilization in which we are living in is a spawn of the Kemetic civilization, because even to talk about religion, we're talking about something that started as an anti-Kemetic spirituality movement.
So before we go there, I just want a little bit more clarity when you said our ancestors did not create science, because you're making really good points in terms of what how we live today and how it's different from how our ancestors lived, etc. But can you just clarify that statement?
Yeah. So there's really three main pillars that the Western society functions on. It's science, religion, and man, the third one is slipping my mind.
Okay.
And essentially, like, let's just talk about science and religion for now, and then when I remember the next one, when I remember the third one,
Mm.
I'll talk about it. So even science and religion, they're partners in terms of the way that this society functions. So
This
science isn't
Western
ever
society.
going
This
in the
Western society. Right.
Western society.
Hmm.
So science is a creation of the Western approach. Oh, I'm sorry, politics. That's the last one. Sorry, politics. Politics, religion, and science are all they're all working together. But people seem to think that those three things are not connected. Because even the way we talk about it, even the way it's framed in a way that, okay, you can't allow religion to mix with government. You can't allow religion to mix with science. And the way that we're conditioned to think is that these three things don't intertwine and don't interconnect. But these three things are actually working together in order to keep someone locked into the way that the colonizer functions and the way that the colonizer thinks. So, academia, anthropology, politics, religion, science, all of these things are creations that are coming from the colonizer's perspective, not from our ancestors' perspective. So, when I'm saying that science is not something that was created by our ancestors, I'm talking about science that we know it in the West in terms of the way that science functions, the way that science, the fixation on the material, the fixation on what they can prove. Science has nothing to do with spirituality because science doesn't move past the third dimension. Science only can talk about the third dimension. It's the reason why they can't tell you about the moon or what's on the other side of the moon because you are looking at it within the third dimension. So, in order to find out what's on the other side of the moon, then you have to access a dimension past the third dimension. So, we have to be very careful in terms of misleading the people. We have to be very careful about using these colonial terms, using this colonial way of life, using this colonial way of functioning, the colonial conditioning, the colonial education, and thinking that we are living our ancestors' way of life because we're not. We're not. And we have to be very careful about misleading people to make them think that they're living or functioning from their ancestral paradigm when what
Hmm.
they're doing is living the colonizing, literally living colonization and then calling it their ancestral paradigm because they think that they understand it because they learned it from the colonizer and anthropology and academia and their way of framing it and their misunderstandings and their way of studying it and attempting to co-opt the culture.
I agree with that. I agree with what you said. That makes sense. So just to sum it up, you know, what it's a reiteration that we must always get our information and our perspective pre-colonial. It has to come from our original source. And so, my opinion, when I hear people say Africans created math, African created science, Africans created language, what we did was we observed these this that existed before. I don't know about language, but those the forces of nature, the what the divine has created existed before human beings. And so since we were here first, we were able to observe those things and codify them so that we could discuss them and learn from it. But we can't create science. We can't create math. Math, one of my favorite subjects, I've said is the language of nature, is the language of the divine. That's my own little take on it, because math gives you a tangible, visual way to understand how things happen naturally. And then physics is just math in motion, which I liked physics as well. So I agree with your assessment. I'm glad that that was cleared up, because there I glanced at some of the comments in the chat. Just wanted to make sure we covered that one before we moved on for that. So, thank you for that. Let me ask you a quick question.
Mhm.
Without you telling us or giving away things in that are initiated that cannot be discussed,
Mhm.
because I'm initiated and I understand that you can't disclose things and should not, because it's sacred information. It needs to continue to be protected. You can go on YouTube and see people performing ceremonies that should not be for public consumption.
Mhm.
So, but is there something that you can share that is a part of the Dogon tradition that has come through and has been protected for thousands of years, that you can share an expression, a symbol, um, a, um, a publicly known ritual, something like that, to share with everyone?
So, you know, we're everyone knows of the region on a colonial map, or the colonial place on a map called Egypt.
Right.
And that's where you can find the Nile Valley. That's where you can find, the pyramids. That's where you can find, a lot of the Kemetic temples that are still standing.
Mhm.
Egypt doesn't exist in our Kemetic archives. Egypt itself is not something that we have in our Kemetic archives. Hejeptah is something that we have. And Hejeptah translates to the rising of Ta within.
Mm.
And that's a way of living. That's a way that you choose to live. So when, we're talking about how our ancestors created math, our ancestors created civilization, where this spark of Hejeptah even comes from, it comes from, there's a story that we get in the initiation called the 19th of Tehuti. And it's not a story, it's a historical event. There's a historical event that's shared in the initiation called the 19th of Tehuti, where the world of the gods expressed themselves and manifested themselves to humanity and asked humanity, what is your agenda? What are you like? What's your agenda? What's your goal? And we responded that we wanted to be like them, that we wanted to be like the world of the gods. And there's a lot that goes into that story. There's a lot that goes into this event that that are felt to this day. And we don't know about this without the fact that it was these bloodlines and these families that preserved this for thousands of years. So we, in a way, we have to understand that when we're really trying to, quantify or share what our ancestors did and how our ancestors functioned, then in terms of rituals, in terms of something sacred, then you have to know that everything that our ancestors did was rooted in trying to move toward the world of the gods, was trying to be and become like the divine and become divine. So
Mm.
I share this to say that, you know, we have to be very careful about, you know, the way we try and contextualize things based on our ignorance, based on the fact that we don't have that, based on the fact that this initiation has been missed and has been hidden for thousands of years, and the initiation into that way of life to even walk toward the divine and understand the tools that you need, the way of the approach, the mindset that you need in order to walk toward the divine, and to become like the divine that's necessary and needed, is through initiation. So the initiation camps that have been preserved by the Dogon, the initiation camps, the Imtam mystery schools, where there's these actual temples that you can find throughout Merita that have preserved this culture, is very different than, you know, someone that's, you know, starting an organization or talking about an organization that is based in a colonial approach, like anthropology, like you name it, Egyptology, etc. Because
That one's the worst.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm sorry, I was just saying that one's the worst.
Oh, oh,
That the
oh, yeah,
agenda of Egyptology is pretty much
yeah,
their logo, the tagline.
yeah. So Master Naba is someone that is from these temples, is someone that brought this from these temples. So I don't want to even get into too many initiatic concepts without making sure that people really understand that and begin to, you know, turn their eyes to the traditional culture in that way. Because when we talk about traditional culture, we're talking about it stemming from Kemet and people fighting to preserve it and ensure that it survived. So I'm not going to do a disservice to the temples that I report back to in West Africa. I'm not going to do a disservice to the work that many ancestors fought and died for and were killed for by misrepresenting the work and having people stay in the ignorance that, you know, every organization or every perspective, in terms of when something's coming from the perspective of anthropology, when something's coming from the perspective of Egyptology, or, you know, these colonial ways of functioning where they go to these indigenous societies and they study, or they look at the remnants, they look at the, you know, archaeological artifacts, archaeology, all of the ologies, all of the modern society ways of functioning.
Right.
I'm not going to talk to a person. I'm going to do my best to talk to that person's ancestors that's bringing them on the line to hear this, because this isn't about Tutibsaa. And I want to be sure that people really understand that this isn't about me. This isn't about me as a person. This is about what's standing behind me. This is about what I'm standing on.
That's right.
And that's what we have to bring it back to. We have to bring the conversation and the way that we're looking at things, and we have to turn our attention back to the things that our ancestors were standing on, And we have to understand and learn that in order to reclaim that, you have to go to where the actual culture is maintained and preserved. And you have to go to these temples that actually have it. You can't get it from the colonizer and think they can give you back what you lost or what your ancestors had or held.
What they
You
took.
can't get
Right.
it.
That's
You
right.
can't get it from them. So we can't do a disservice to the people. We can't do a disservice to people that are ignorant or people that don't know, because everyone doesn't know at some point or another.
That's right.
Someone is not born just knowing. You have to be initiated. You have to be taught. You have to learn. Even the way that what our ancestors were able to achieve came through, connecting with the world of the gods and them giving us tools, them giving us a way to become like them, giving us a guideline, giving us a way to live that we call the 77 commandments, the divine book, the divine ordinances. So we really have to be sure that we're having honest conversations and we're being honest with ourselves and we're being honest about what we're doing and what we're really standing on and how we're really functioning, because we can't entertain our egos to make ourselves feel better, and just to make ourselves feel better by recognizing another person's ignorance just to not make them feel bad. We have to be honest and we have to be direct and we have to talk about these things in an honest way and recognize when something is coming from our ancestors and when something isn't. So we have to be very careful about framing things and contextualizing things for people in ways where, we're misleading them or feeding into their ignorance, because our ancestors are bringing us together to have these talks and to talk about what our ancestors were able to preserve and the temples that are actually fighting for this and preserving this for a reason, not for you or me or for anyone else that's on this line to feed into our ignorance and to feed into our egos. So again, we just need to be very careful about, feeding into that ignorance that what everyone is standing on is the same, because there are temples, there are places where people are actually standing on these principles, that are actually standing on the Kemetic way of life, that is Kemet. You go to these different regions and it's Kemet because it's not a geographical territory, it's a cultural territory that sits atop a geographical location. So if there's one temple in which people are living according to those principles and functioning in that way, Kemet can be anywhere as long as the culture is there, as long as those people are living in that way. So we just have to be very careful about misleading people or feeding into that ignorance.
You made a lot of good points. I'm going to just highlight a couple of them so that we can always, Tuesday Talk is fun. We get to hear a lot of great information, but we definitely need to make sure that we are immediately given tools to use that are tangible, that make a recognizable and quantifiable difference in our lives. Because as Pan African people, at this point, we need to be gathering our knowledge, but we also need to be doing. There has to be a learning and a doing at the same time. Okay. Traditionally, you hear things like you can either work with your work with your hands or use your head. I always thought that was dumb, because if you're working with your hands, somebody had to teach you how to do the things that you're doing. And so I'm applying that principle to what we're doing here with Tuesday Talking with our guests. Just to bullet some of the things that Tutibsa said, we want to make sure that we get our knowledge and information from our actual ancestors, and not from these institutions and structures that are really products of white supremacy and racism. Okay, we don't. That's not going to help us. We're not going to get what we need from the people who took it from us in the first place. That makes no sense. Now, I'm paraphrasing it the way a Boots a Shot speaks. So the message is the same, but this is how I'm saying it. They ain't giving it to us. We can't get it from them. And what they're giving us is not something that's going to free our minds, period. Okay?
Mhm.
That's the
And I
first thing.
think, let me just, say this real quick is we have a lot of people that think that we have what our ancestors had when we actually don't. And we have that due to the fact that we're in a very dire situation. We're in a very dire situation because we haven't had the practical means and the practical resources to connect with our ancestors, and we've lost our culture. For a lot of us, we've lost our culture. And during my time, even reporting back to the temples in West Africa, and even going through spiritual purifications and going back to these temples and seeing it with my own eyes, and even having the privilege to go through these spiritual purifications and see the culture alive and well that has been preserved since the time of the pharaohs, and see these practices that even a spiritual purification, to be able to receive a spiritual purification that the pharaoh had received when he was being prepared for his uh, ruling period. I don't think we can really, you know, take the time to make sure that people know that this culture is alive and well, and that it exists, and that people can get back to it.
I think that we are in a bit of a where we are in a phase in a space where people want to learn, people want to know.
Mhm.
Ghana had the year of return in 2019. We have organizations like the Toronto Ma'at and the things that we do here, Tuesday Talks. There's Happy. They have an interview talk show on Thursdays. We've got AfricanAncestry.com. All of the people are searching and looking, and eventually you find what you're looking for, which is kind of like what I was saying at the beginning. Like I had to get out there and find it, you know. So we're not going to have everything back, because nothing ever stays the same. Even if our lineage weren't broken the way that it was, something would be different, because things progress, and things are dynamic and things change. But I do believe and do think that part of the turmoil that we have in this world right now is because people are coming into knowledge, into into accurate knowledge, into non-colonial knowledge. Some people embrace it, some people fight it, and that's what we're living in. And that's why we see all, a little bit of madness, going on here, you know um but to kind of just to continue to sum up what you were saying before, we want to make sure we get our information as pure as possible from a source that comes from our ancestors. The other thing you said is, this isn't about you, it's about who's standing behind you, and what you're standing on. And when you talk to people who are African spiritual practitioners of any name, because it's all the same at its core, okay?
Mhm.
So when you speak to an African spiritual practitioner, they talk about the ancestors that walk with them.
Mhm.
They talk about the ancestors that are around them. I come with my ancestors. I'm getting chills right now just even saying that.
Mhm.
And so as you continue to search, you will find. You continue to purify and fast. You fast and you get up before the sun comes up around 5, 5:30, 4:35 rather. You're going to hear from the ancestors. You're going to get your message while you're sleeping. I know I do. Your body has to be prepared to be able to receive that. So when you are functioning in that space, you'll be able to tell the difference between what when you're hearing and receiving certain information. Okay. So yes, the topic was the Dogon tribe, but Tutibs have been talking about African spirituality this whole time. I hope y'all understand that. These are different names. A lot of these names are come from our experience post the enslavement trade. And so these names are colonial, you know, part of the turmoil that happens on the continent, like in any place that's been colonized, is the colonizer draws these artificial lines and disrupts families and puts people together that are not in the same family. So yes, it's important to know where Egypt is, but it's also important to know what Kemet means, the region where a culture was practiced. Okay. A lot of what we do with the Shrine of Ma'at, we just had our high priestess and priest and some members of the shrine in Ghana. And to Tipsa's point, there are people who were in Ghana who say their ancestors came from Kemet, and they had already this knowledge of the spirituality that was practiced then, that came from, I would imagine, and I'm just guessing, that came from their direct ancestors who were their direct relatives. Okay. A lot of times when we say ancestors, it's an esoteric, it gives an esoteric feeling that's kind of in your head. But that just means your great, 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 great grandparents from way, 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 way back in the day. These were our relatives. These were our family members. That's what that means when we say ancestors. And sometimes when I'm contemplating or meditating or reading, I switch the word from ancestor to relative, and it makes it more real. And from my experience makes it, I feel more encouraged to continue, because it's like learning your, it's not like you're learning your family history. Okay. So one of the tangible things that we're going to take away from this, we're going to wrap up coming shortly. I still have a question or two um, for Tutipsa, is we want to make sure we know our source of information. Who's telling me this? Is it the oppressor? Is it the colonizer? Or is this coming from a pure source? Is this coming from did my ancestors tell me this? The second thing is, a trip to the continent is something that you should do so you can see it with your own eyes. Seeing something, being in the space, feeling that heat, seeing Ra, seeing Ra with your own eyes on the continent is a different experience. I went to Cuba, and the way that the sun interacts with you in Cuba is even different. Then I went to what is called Egypt. I went to Kemet, and it's just a whole, it makes sense why all of our ancient relatives were able to create that civilization and why Ra was so important. Because if you spend all that time in Kemet, you're going to have a different understanding of about the sun, about Ra, and you get maybe a minuscule glimpse into what is a fraction or a sliver of what our relatives, our ancient relatives, experienced back then. Okay. Takeaway: know your source of information. Two, try to get to the continent. Two tips. So, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point because I think you're touching on something, you know, that we really need to that we really need to make sure that we're making clear,
Mm-hmm.
because our ancestors communicate with us in very specific ways, and they are communicating with us many different ways. And a lot of times we don't have the tools, or we're not able to recognize how they're communicating with us. That's really one of our biggest problems, is the fact that we don't know when they're communicating with us. We don't know how they're communicating with us. And then we don't know what they're communicating. So one of the huge benefits that someone can gain by getting initiated back into the culture is gaining the ability to understand those communications coming from your ancestors,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding what your ancestors are communicating, what they need you to do, what the actual practical practices that you can do to connect with them and make sure you're giving them what they need. So it's really important for us to distinguish and draw the line between, you know, where some of these places that you can go to another part of, you can go to Africa, but you can't go to Merita without having a way into the culture. And it's important for us to distinguish between the two, because anyone can go to Africa, and that's just the colonial version of Africa. Because you can go to Africa and just get another taste of the colonial society. And you can go to different parts of Africa, and you can go to different parts of the continent, and then you're just going to a place that functions from the Western philosophy and the function from the Western way of life, and then they're just attempting and catering to bring in people from the West in order to economically, you know, raise the places that they're at, or to, you know, develop further from nature. So we need to be very, you know, we have to be very deliberate in that it's easy to go to Africa. Anyone can go to Africa, but to go to Merita, that's a whole different thing. To go back to the culture where it's alive, to go back to these temples, to go back to these villages in Merita where the traditional culture is alive and it's being practiced, is different from when you just go to these colonial places in Africa and you're just going there to make yourself feel better because you're on the continent. It becomes an emotional thing. It becomes a imaginary thing where we're making ourselves feel better because it's like, well, I've been to Africa. I had been to Sudan. I had been to Egypt, but it wasn't until I went to West Africa that I went to Marytown, and I went back to the culture, and I went back to the traditions, and I saw it in real time, and I participated in it in real time. So we have to be sure that we're not, you know, that these things, when we talk about them, that we're distinguishing and we're communicating and informing people to allow them to understand what's actually being preserved, what's actually alive, and the difference.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense. When we travel with the Shrine of Ma'at, and I think that anyone who travels, and even if they are going just taking the tours through the temples and tombs, that is most certainly a place to start, because regardless of how they got inside a temple or a tomb, they see the work of our ancestors. They see what our ancient relatives did, and it's definitely an easier, more accessible way into seeing what they've done. And that is definitely better than not ever having seen it. And and I agree with you that you have to have authentic experiences with people, and to see how the culture, how people actually live. Like, I'll give an example. When I went to Cuba, I went with a group. There were a lot of Latinos in the group. They spoke Spanish. they got a different experience when we went to Cuba than people who didn't speak Spanish. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but not like that. And so we went into one of the neighborhoods, and they gave us like a celebration. And then after the celebration was over, people were just talking, going in and out of each other's homes, and just having a conversation with people outside, and that level of conversation was outside of the planned trip. And those of us who didn't speak Spanish, and those of us who were not Latinos, Latina, whatever, with any different kind, we did not get the same experience because we weren't able to just be more authentic. So I definitely agree with that. But I also think that it's important to start where you are, and to again know what your source is. You go into one of these tours, and you have someone giving you a tour that is sanctioned by the tourist bureau in Egypt. It's going to be different than if you go and you come with the Shrine of Ma'at, and Jabari explains it from his perspective. And he's definitely been Western trained. He'll say that himself. Most of us have been, because we have no other choice. Those are the only schools that we have a chance to go to. But he's also studied under people who most certainly did not have a colonized mind. So I am agreeing with you 100%. What I am saying is we need everybody that's Pan-African needs some sort of entry point, and to be met where they are, so that they can then at least get into the space and then take it that step further to get a real, true, authentic experience of an uninterrupted segment or part of the culture. I do one thing that I did want to ask about was the book. Do you have the book with you?
I don't have a physical copy with me, but everyone
Okay.
can go to the earthcenter.org and then they can get the book. You're talking about the philosophy podium, correct?
Yes. I have my book. It's in the other room. I I, I should have had it right next to me. I don't want to just run and get it. Um, my my house is being renovated, so it's not as easy to go get the book right now. I apologize for it, but yes, but the you can get the book. Can you give me the name of the book one more time? I'm going to put it in the chat.
Philosophy podium.
The Philosophy Podium.
Mhm.
Can you tell me, or can you tell us just a little bit about what the Philosophy Podium is about?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that you can go get in terms of on these, and you can go get on the Dogon. There's a lot of information that you can Google on Wikipedia right now. You can Google and find whatever resources through academia, through these colonial institutions, you name it. Uh, and everything's going to be talking about the Dogon and about their studies of the Dogon and about the Dogon do this and the Dogon do that and etc. But to there's only one book that's written by a Dogon, and that's the Philosophy Podium by Master Naba. That's the Initiatic Tales of Hegypton. That's the Book of Purifications by Neb Naba Lamusa Dinabig and Naba Idita Shenmira. So again, it's about turning our attention and making sure that people understand that there's a difference. There's a difference between studying things. There's a difference between going to colonial Africa. There's a difference between, where the things that, people are standing on is coming from. There's a difference between where, where knowledge is coming from. There's a difference. There's a big difference. And we we just have to be sure that we're directing people to the culture and directing people to the resources that is going to allow them to step out of colonization and not make them feel like they're going back into they're just getting a different flavor of colonization just because they're going to another continent. And the philosophy podium in what Master Naba talks about is he breaks down so many different topics, so many different things. He talks about politics, he talks about religion, he talks about science, he talks about the way that this culture functions. He talks about the way colonization and this colonial society moves. And he talks about history. He talks about a lot of history that's not in history books, that's in the book of history, because those are two different things. And we
Say
have
that
to
again.
be
I think people might have missed that. Say that one more
there's a
time.
lot in the book of history
The
that's
book of
not in
history.
history books.
Right.
And we have to be sure that we're giving people a chance to reclaim what was lost and not making themselves feel better by going on a comedic themed history tour that's coming from the perspective of uh, the colonizer, and or coming from these coming from people that are standing on colonial based studies of what our ancestors did. So, the resources are out there. The philosophy podium, people can pick it up. We have an online generation starting this weekend. September 18th is the orientation. We have many temples throughout uh, different parts of America. We have a temple in Chicago. We have a temple in New Jersey, in Newark. We have a temple in Baltimore. We have a temple in Houston. And we have two temples in Canada for people that are tuning in Canada. We have a temple in Montreal. We have a temple in Toronto. We have temples in the UK. We have one in London. We have one in Coventry. We have 3 temples amongst many other temples that we report back to in Merita. So, it's a big thing. It's a huge thing. We're talking about a mission that's been around for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a way of life that's been around for thousands of years that is founded in and based in harmonizing with the existence, becoming like the divine, becoming the divine. So it's just it's it's big. I don't want to minimize this culture and all the temples back home that we are a part of, and all the temples back home that we represent. This culture that our ancestors fought for, and this culture that our ancestors died for, sacrificed many generations to preserve by, equating it and making it seem like everything that everyone can gain access to is the same. Because I just can't. I'm not going to be able to, uh, be honest and think about someone's ancestors that are guiding someone to reclaim things that have been lost, and then I'm going to tell them to go to I'm going to tell them to go to a colonial place in Africa, thinking that they can reclaim this, thinking that they can gain this back, or thinking that they can go to, wherever, and that they can get it. So the philosophy podium, there's a lot that Master Naba touches on, and everyone can pick it up and everyone can read it, and if there was anything I would tell people to go study in terms of a book, I would tell them to go study the philosophy podium, to just even maybe start that uh, process of decolonization, to get to something real and something that's actually rooted in the traditions.
Something that begins the decolonization process, something that's real and something that's rooted in the tradition. That is a nice summary of what the Philosophy Podium by Master Naba is about. Okay. I planned on us talking about the book a bit more, but but what we did was we talked about the essence of the book, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
and not the book per se exactly. But definitely understand that this is one of those things that you do. Remember, we're not just looking and, oh, this is great. Thank you for coming on, and thank you, Boots Shop. No, we have work to do, and part of our work is, and the most important part to some degree, is decolonizing our minds. And I will say this: we are not born. All of us were born in a period of colonization. All of us were born in this time in the history of the planet. Okay, so when you're dealing with people who try hard to to decolonize their minds, be open to understanding that there may be some remnants or some things you believe or say or think that are still a part of that colonized paradigm. So this is a process,
It's a
and
long
every
process.
day that's
It's a
right.
it's a
And
generational process that's really going to take a lot of courage, and it's going to take a lot of strength for us to really stop, and for us to really be honest with ourselves, to say, you know, how do I legitimately start this process? Where can I begin, and how do I begin to ensure that when I make it to the other side and I'm attempting to make it back to my ancestral vestibule, that I'm giving myself a chance by making sure that my descendants know how to practically take care of me when I become an ancestor, and when I become when I transition, excuse me. So it it's not something that we can really leave in the philosophical domain. It's not something that we can leave in the in a imaginative domain. We have to make it real, and we have to make sure that people know, and that we're being honest, and that people know the difference between these things, because we can become very, because we're so starved for connecting with our ancestors, that we'll even take the colonial version of what looks like our ancestral practices in order to make us feel better, so that we can feel like we're walking that path toward it. So, you're making a lot of great points that are important to highlight, that we need to be sure that we're taking the practical steps, and we're understanding what the practical steps are.
right, that's right. We have to we have to read and think and learn and then do. And one of the things that you mentioned before was you can't just keep reading stuff and thinking that you're having this experience. You're not. You have an experience because you have an experience. So so yeah, so I just wanted to kind of bring all of that together towards the end. But the Philosophy Podium by Master Nava is a great place to start, and just be steadfast and continue on your own journey. And it's a process. It's a lifelong personal process for each individual. It's a family process in terms of healing yourself and feeling and healing your family. It's a generational process, from one generation to the next. Okay, so we're in multiple processes at the same time, but I've turned it into something that I really enjoy, and it instills a sense of pride, and you have this positive synergistic momentum when you shift your frame of mind from, oh my god, I have to do all this reading so I can learn all about my history, to i'm finding I am finding my culture, and this is exciting. I am finding the authentic original source. I'm
Mhm.
it's invigorating, And to anyone who feels, who feels daunted
Mhm.
by the process, just get in it, appreciate it, and be grateful that you have found it. There are people who still have it. Okay. So I just want to encourage everyone to continue on in this process, because it's a great feeling every day when you take another step towards your who you really truly are. Okay. But you got to be courageous and all of those things, because it's not easy, but it's worth it. All right.
Because
So
it's really important, you know, that we reclaim it and
that's
that we
right.
live it. And you know, it's we can't reclaim what was lost by it remaining an intellectual exercise. We can't reclaim what was lost by it remaining a mental exercise
That's right.
where it's about, I'm I'm gonna get this book and I'm gonna get that book and I'm gonna get that book and then I'm just gonna read it and then I'm just gonna allow it to remain here. Because at the end of the day, it's about understanding that there's a way of doing things, there's a way of life, there's an approach that our ancestors had, and you're only going to get that by going to the initiation that your ancestors preserved and by understanding what the initiation is and what it was for our ancestors, is
Hmm.
and was, and what it was founded in and what it came from and what it's for. Because we really have to give ourselves a chance by understanding that the initiation is different from reading a book and thinking that you can reclaim what was lost by reading a book.
That's right. Get it can't stay in the head. You have to do. You reclaim by doing. You reclaim by
Mhm.
doing. So I'm gonna leave close out Tuesday talk with what Tutibsa just said. And as always, it was a pleasure having you here. And make sure you guys go and get
Appreciate you
your
for
book.
having me.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And we're gonna put the links up when this is over and the broadcast is like put where it's supposed to
Yeah.
be. We're gonna put the links there so you guys can not only get the philosophy podium by Master Kaba, but you can also get the calendar. Is the calendar ready for purchase?
So the calendar, we're just waiting to get it back from the print. So once we get it, then people will start getting it. So that'll be soon. And you can check our website. It's actually listed on the product itself,
Mhm.
the date. And yeah, again, we have the online initiation. So the initiation that even what I was sharing from even the knowledge on the calendar, a little bit that I was sharing about Hejipta and about the 19th of Tehuti and some of these initiatic concepts and the history. A lot of the history that's not in the history books, it's in the book of history. You get that in the initiation. And that initiation, the initiation's available at any of our locations whenever the doors are open. The doors of initiation are open, but for those that aren't close to a temple or are in another country or another part of the world where we don't have a temple, then the online generation is really your opportunity to get in. So I would, tell you that if you feel called, if you feel like something behind you is pushing you, something is really, giving you the push on your heart, the push on your mind, the push on your spirit to really, take that step to reclaiming what was lost. I would tell you, the online gen is that opportunity if you don't have the capability to make it to one of our physical locations, our physical temples.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Tipsa. Always a
Thank you.
pleasure. I'm sure our paths will cross soon and often.
Hopefully
Yes,
the ancestors bring us together again.
yes, definitely. So I want to thank everybody who was here with us tonight for Tuesday Talks. Tuesday Talk, I enjoy doing it. I hope you guys get a lot out of it. I appreciate, when you mention, um, when you hit me up and say, "Oh, I liked, Tuesday Talk was great." I appreciate it. It lets me know that I'm bringing on the right people and giving you the knowledge that you need. So if there's one takeaway, learn it and then do it. Okay. And with that, I'm going to say Shemamatep and go forth in peace.
Idiot.